The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to Enterprise Hive's webinar on community management. Enterprise Hive is pleased to provide you with convenient access to industry experts covering the hottest topics, trends, and best practices in engagement for higher education. Get ready for a valuable, engaging, and thought-provoking session. Today's webinar is sponsored by Enterprise Hive, and our presenters are Rachel Happy and Mike Matthews. My name is Lauren Hart Piper. I'm the Vice President of Product Management and Marketing for Enterprise Hive. And before we begin, let me share the format of our webinar today. Our presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes for questions and answers. During the presentation, all attendees will be muted, and we will open up the line for live questions and discussion during the Q&A section of the presentation. During the webinar, you can submit questions in writing using the question text box on your webinar control panel. When we begin the question and answer portion of our webinar, we will answer the written questions first, and then if time allows, we'll take the live questions from the audience. So at this time, I'd like to begin our presentation, Community Management to Drive Engagement in Higher Ed. But before I turn the presentation over to Rachel and Mike, let me first tell you a little bit about Enterprise Hive. Enterprise Hive brings to higher education an innovative social engagement platform. HiveSocial for higher education is the only social engagement solution designed specifically for the complexities found within higher ed, from the multiple roles a person may have on campus to the ever-changing demographics of today's student. A cloud-based software-as-a-service solution that is the most configurable platform available today. HiveSocial requires little to no technical knowledge or IT support to implement and manage. The platform is all-inclusive with a full suite of collaboration and networking tools that can serve the requirements for a modern student portal, a campus intranet, faculty network, and much more. With HiveSocial, online communities in higher ed can improve institutional effectiveness by being able to connect people to people and people to information so they can learn by getting the information they need to be better students, employees, as well as engaging with reward and recognition. So let's start our webinar, and I'd like to introduce our presenters today. So if we go to the next slide, our webinar is going to be presented by our speakers, Rachel Happy, who is the co-founder and principal of the Community Roundtable, and she is co-presenting with Mike Matthews, CIO at Oral Roberts University. Our agenda today will be, to the next slide, Rachel is going to talk about what is community management, and then what is the value that community management brings to an institution, as well as then giving you some of the principles and a structure for how you can build a community roadmap. And then let's see a community roadmap in process and how it can really work with a case study presented by Mike from Oral Roberts University. And then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting us to have this webinar and share some information about community management and the research we have. First, I'd like to just level set and share my perspective on what community management is. Mike, if you switch to the next slide, I think community management is really critical to ensuring that organizations are getting value out of their online community initiatives. It's not one of those situations where you build it, you deploy it, and you automatically get value. Sometimes you do. But rarely, unless you guide it in a really assertive manner, do you get the value that you're trying to out of it. One example of that in education is some evolving research about how online communities for teachers can really have measurable effects on the student test scores. So it's a secondary effect in that case. The teachers are the ones engaging and learning online about testing environments and how to improve their students' knowledge. But that's a very measurable outcome, if you will. So some of the responsibilities of community management are to define the scope, the ideal outcomes, and the boundary conditions of what's going to go on in the community. What are we all there for? What's the shared purpose? Why are we chatting together? What are we learning together? Secondly, and this is something that I think a lot of people miss, which is ensuring that all participants and all stakeholders are receiving more value than they're contributing, because if that doesn't happen, then they go away and they don't come back. And part of that is promoting, encouraging, and rewarding the productive behavior so that people do feel like they're getting value out of participation. Obviously, there's some moderation and discouraging destructive behaviors that go along with it, doing a lot of measuring in the background and monitoring to make sure the community is producing those outputs. And then one of the things that we hear from our members all the time is one of the things required for online community management is a lot of stakeholder education. Online communities are relatively new to our organizations, and a lot of people don't understand how they complement offline engagement and how they can best be used and generate value. So a lot of work goes into just training and education. But having a CM allows you to avoid some predictable downfalls of community. The first one, and if you go to the next slide, is what I call a ghost town. This is probably the single most thing that people are worried about, which is a community with no activity. The second issue is what I call a land of 1,000 flowers. And this is when you have so much activity and a lot of social activity that for new members, it's really hard to see and find value immediately. So they often go away because they can't figure out where to land in the community. The third problem that often comes up is if you don't have good community management, you can get into the situation of having what I call drama central, a lot of angst or negativity or trolling that just goes unabated. And obviously that makes it a really ugly place to be, and so the people who actually have productive interests don't come back. The next situation is similar, but I call it a circling storm, because this is when there are legitimate issues that go unaddressed, and they can snowball very quickly into a crisis. And if you're not monitoring it, this can really take you by surprise. And then the last one is sort of a hidden risk, but it's a click. And initially, clicks look really good because there's usually a lot of engagement within them. But if they start to get exclusive and they take over the community, then other people don't feel welcome. Your community doesn't grow. And so the community manager's job is to just gently break that up or kind of have it isolated into a corner where it can happen, but it doesn't take over the entire community. And if we go to the overall purpose of community management in the next slide, I see it as this Venn diagram, which is community managers are really responsible for understanding the business objectives that the school has for launching a community. We see communities launch for a range of purposes. Some of it is for students. Some of it is for faculty or teachers. There's exchange student communities, so organizations that are sending their students abroad but really want to stay connected to them. That's a great case study. Alumni communities are obviously a really compelling case study for higher ed. And then the member objectives, really understanding what the members or the participants that the community is targeted at will get value from so that they come back on a regular basis. Because if they don't come back on a regular basis, then you've got no community. And where those two objectives overlap is really what I call the shared purpose, and where you can really build shared value together. And the better and more meaningfully you can articulate that shared purpose, the better the engagement you're going to have and the more constructive the engagement you're going to have. Meaning people like to know what they're supposed to be doing. So if you tell them exactly what you'd like them to be doing in your community, they're more likely to do it. It's not a guarantee, but they're more likely. So spending time up front, really thinking about what's going to provide value for both of those groups, and then balancing over time. And it is a constant balancing act. You tend to kind of go back and forth between what the business wants and what the member wants, and making sure that neither one of those kind of gets overwhelmed is really the objective. So if we move on and look at, what is the value of community management? Can we quantify this? I like to think of it in this way, which is communities are really not only nice to have, but required to change behavior, to drive growth, to drive innovation. And that really encompasses what higher education and learning is all about. So this is a little diagram from The Power of Habit, and Charles Duhigg says there's 3 things required to change behavior. And the first one is the mechanics of the change. What am I going to do instead of what I used to do to change a behavior? The second is belief that the change is a good thing and that it's possible for me. And those 2 things can get you to change behavior. But the third thing that you need is a community if you want to change that behavior sustainably over time, because you need social reinforcement when you hit times of stress. People tend to go back to their prior behavior if they're stressed, unless they have that social encouragement and social support to continue on their path. And so if you're looking at any kind of complex education or innovation or change, those are the 3 elements of that. If you go to the next slide, when we did our research this year around community management, we found that our key findings aligned kind of nicely with those 3 things, which is the first one, which is community process maturity drives business value, meaning having a more sophisticated approach to the system by which you structure and manage your community really reflects in the ability to measure its value in the end. And that's the mechanics, how you're going to go about this. The second thing that we found correlated with engagement, and we'll dig into these a little later, is that executive participation really impacted success. And executive participation on a college campus or a university campus is deans, provosts, administration people. Having them involved really gives students and everybody, every part of the community, the belief that the online community is an important element of communication in that wider community. And then lastly, advocacy programs also correlate with higher engagement numbers. And when we think of advocacy programs, we're really thinking of emergent community leaders. So these may be students that run student groups. They may be individual students who just participate and really seem to kind of align their interests with that of the community and are very active. And so you want to give those people a formal role and recognition within the community because that really helps scale engagement across the ecosystem. So unpacking this a little more, if we look at the research, we broke down our research into looking at average communities and their practices, and then we pulled out what we call a best-in-class segment. And the best-in-class segment were those communities, the top 20% of communities that were really well-managed, the most well-managed communities. And then we looked at the communities that can measure their value. And average communities, 48% of them could measure their value. And I really look at that number and I say that's roughly gambling. Because if I'm a stakeholder and I'm looking at that and saying I've got a 50% shot of getting value out of this investment, there's a lot of other priorities that are more of a sure thing. However, if you look at that 85% number, that's a really sound investment. If I'm 85% likely to get my investment back, then that's a pretty compelling case. So it's a pretty big difference between best-in-class and average there. And the second thing that best-in-class communities are more likely to do is have fully funded roadmaps. And what I mean by that is the community team has really laid out all the programming and initiatives that are required to have a mature, developed community program. And they've said, this is how much it's going to cost, this is when we want to do it, this is how we're going to deploy that, here's who's going to be responsible. And they've gotten buy-in from their stakeholders and confirmed investment to execute in that roadmap. if you look at average communities, only about 35% of them have fully resourced roadmaps. So that's a lot of ambition without the ability to execute on it. So that's a big risk that we uncovered there. So my message is, if you wanted to build a value-producing community program, really think through the management that's going to be required to produce those results and invest in it. Because if you invest in it, it will produce that. It has a high likelihood of producing value. And that's important to understand, because before we had this research, it really was a gamble. And it's a long-term investment, and it makes it very hard for stakeholders to have the faith that investing in management processes is going to pay off. So that was very encouraging. So I look at the next factor, which is executive engagement. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the slide, which is the engagement piece, which is probably the most exciting piece. Mike, if you could switch over the slide to the engagement profile. There is an old rule of thumb online that online communities get a 99-1 engagement profile, and 90% of the members of a community are lurkers. Over a couple of years, we've really found that that is not the case at all, and in fact, it's quite different. In average communities, there's only 63% of their population that's lurkers. 17% contribute, 11% create content, and then we added this collaborator segment, which is people who are working together to create something new. They're not just posting a blog post or a document, but they're really developing something together. And in the best-in-class communities, almost 50% are engaging in some way. And so that really has a huge impact on outcomes and ability to drive value. So I encourage all of you to really think about this and what profile you want. And I have a perspective that's a little different than the rest of the market, which is, I think as you deploy and develop your community, you start off with a very small population and you drive towards the engagement or the behavior change you want early on, and then grow once you see that behavior profile that you want, versus inviting everyone in your network into the community but not having established those behavioral norms that get them to engage. I think that's actually a much quicker way to get to an overall positive, constructive engagement profile. One of the things that contributes to that, and now we can move on to the executive participation, is how many of your executives, and again in this case it's deans, provosts, administrative personnel, are participating in the community. And we think participation matters. It's not just their support and their financial and communication support, but actually getting in the community and using it as a place to communicate really models behavior for everyone else. And we also found that there's a correlation between those communities that have high executive participation and fully resourced roadmaps. So 50% of the communities that had good, of all the communities that had executive participation, 50% of them had approved roadmaps, which was higher than the 35% average. The data at the bottom is less analogous for the higher ed group, but we do see, as you get up in the C-level, the very top of the organization, if you can get those people participating, it sends a very strong message to the rest of the organization and the ecosystem. And again, feeds the belief that this online community is an important place to communicate. And then lastly, from our key findings, we looked at advocacy programs and the impact on engagement that those programs have. So if you flip to the next slide, we can see the difference in the engagement profile and the profile of who had formal programs. And we saw a big difference in engagement between just formal programs and multi-tiered programs. And I'll explain that in this way, which is formal programs tend to have one layer of VIPs or advocates or your most active members. The multi-tiered programs actually differentiated between people and said there are subject matter experts and they participate in this way. There are very engaged volunteer moderators who love helping the community and assisting, and they have a role to play. And then we have executive stakeholder leaders, and they have a role to play. And having those differentiated, multifaceted roles really had the biggest impact on communities. One implication of advocacy programs is they do require more community managers to manage because you're dealing with more administrative pieces, and they're typically found in older communities, although we're seeing that advocacy programs get started in newer communities more and more. So next, I want to give you a few takeaways about how to actually go about getting some of these results, because you might be thinking at this point, that's all well and good, but how do I think about this so that I actually can execute on some of these results? We've built something called the community maturity model that really helps define and frame the discipline of community management in a way that we think is helpful for just understanding all the piece parts that go into building a productive community and giving people the expectation that you're going to go through multiple phases. This is not something you just turn on and all of a sudden it's successful. So there's 8 competencies. All of these are things your organization already has today: strategy, leadership, culture, content and programming, policies and governance, tools, metrics and measurement. All of them need to be addressed specifically for community. Where does community fit in? Where does online community fit into your overall strategy? And you'll hear from Mike a bit later, which in the higher ed space is really interesting because the online and offline community really blend. So thinking about how the online community can really complement what you're doing in the offline context is really critical. And then in the first phase, you're really concentrating on things like strategy and community management and tools so that you can get the basic building blocks together to launch. And once you've got that initial launch, then you layer on content and programming, policies and governance. You start tracking metrics of success. As you grow, you start building leadership and training programs for everybody so that they really understand how to maximize the use of these communities. So what we did with our research, taking this model, is we compared average and best in class along every competency. So if you look at the next slide, you can see where average and best in class communities are falling in each of these areas. And the encouraging thing for me is that we've gotten universally better at community strategy. If you look, average communities are in stage 3 and the best in class are in stage 4. We've kind of figured that piece out, which is great because it really drives the success of everything else. But there's some lagging competencies here too. One of them is around content and programming. I think there's still the notion that if you build really robust technology and you have a good strategy and you have a good kind of tool set, that people will come and engage. And I look at content and programming as the way to really lead from behind and offer content and programming that will really drive the conversation in ways that add value. And so being really assertive with that is the best lever for kind of getting the behavior and the outcomes you're looking for. And I think of content and programming in 2 ways that may be helpful, which is content is something that you upload into the community or a blog post. It's kind of a static piece of content. It can be user-generated or it can come from the organization. It's what attracts people to the community. It's what triggers them to come back. But programming are online events that get them to engage. So that actually prompts them to have a dialogue with each other. So that could be a weekly Ask Me Anything chat. It could be a weekly newsletter. It could be a weekly question of the week, question of the day, something that's making them come back and participate in some way versus just lurking. So it's a really valuable tool to use, and I think generally communities can do a better job at this. And if you do look at this, you can kind of self-assess yourself. And this is the next stage, to look at your community program and say, do I have a good strategy? Am I addressing leadership issues? What are the cultural pieces like training that I have to promote the use of the community? Have I checked all of these boxes? And once you do that, if you go to the next slide, you can do a gap analysis around where you are today, how confident you are in your community management approach, and lay out where you want to be. And you may not want to be in stage 4 in every competency. That may not be your goal. Your community may just complement one area of your university, and that's fine. But it allows you to see where your gaps are. You may have ambitions to have really good content and programming, but you know you don't yet. And so identifying those areas then allow you to build a roadmap off of that and say, I have a gap in this area. And if you move to the next slide, you can take each of these competencies and say, where do I have a gap, and what initiative am I going to have to invest in to close that gap? And what's the timeline for executing on that initiative? Who's going to own it? What kind of budget do I need for that? Am I going to do it with internal staff, or am I going to hire it out? And you can really lay out an entire roadmap and get to a budget by doing this. So these are all the piece parts of taking your community programming, understanding what kind of community management needs you have on top of the platform needs, and really driving that so that you are getting the increased loyalty or advocacy or learning that you want out of your community program. And with that, we're going to hand it over to Mike, who has a great case study of using community at Oral Roberts. And again, I love his perspective that it's kind of a community within a community. So Mike, do you want to tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure will, Rachel. I'm going to go ahead and turn our video on just so people can see initially who's talking. Give me 1 second here. Right now, you should see myself, Mike Matthews, waving his hand here in my office at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And next to me, a senior here at Oral Roberts University. I'll have him introduce himself.
Alex Biles. Mike, thank you. Rachel, thank you for allowing me on your show.
All right. I'm going to turn the video off for now, and at the end, we'll probably turn it back on. And I'm going to go back to the presentation. So when we think of, give me 1 second here to, okay, Rachel, I'm going to confirm that you're seeing the slide now.
I am.
Okay, great. So again, Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, building global community is, first we have to define what community is. And it's very difficult, but having a roadmap definitely is helpful, but we still have to define what community is. When you think of a university campus, we have a bookstore, we have dorm rooms considered a hotel, restaurants, we have almost political debates. When you think of different kind of meetings and setups, we have an entire IT staff. We are a community within a community, and in many ways, it's easier for a university because we've got confines. We've got 500 acres possibly on one campus or another, and we can actually see the community, we can touch the community, but still, how do we define that, and then how do we begin to measure that? And that's why we're so appreciative of the roadmap that's available to say, let's map it, let's see what the gaps are, let's see if we're as engaging as we think we are. So when you think of Oral Roberts University, our mission, which we want to build our community around, is to build Holy Spirit-empowered leaders through whole person education to impact the world with God's healing. A challenge that Oral Roberts University has is that we're global. 85 different nations come to Tulsa, Oklahoma, with more than one student that touches our community. And so we are definitely global. Our vision, you can read it, is pretty straightforward. How do we raise up students to hear the voice of God and go into every person's world? In order for us to become a globalized university and do it effectively, we have 7 imperatives. And those 7 imperatives are listed. And you can see that imperative number 6 is very much akin to what we're going to be talking about. Social media, technology, mobile technologies. How do we really quickly reach into every person's world with technology? So using new technologies and new paradigms to make spirit-empowered whole person education accessible to millions of people. That's our goal, and that's where we're headed. And we're so appreciative of Enterprise Hive and what they're able to offer us, is how do we bring the fabric together to allow us to connect to people quicker, more seamlessly, but be able to measure that. Do we have a reward system, an award system? Do we have a measurement system with analytics to find out how engaged are our students? And in years prior, it was difficult for us to do that. Everyone had access to our technology, but we had no way to measure that. But now through an engagement software package called HiveSocial, we're able to connect, we're able to measure, and we're able to reward students who are truly becoming engaged in our community. So a little bit more information about the statistics of Oral Roberts University. You can see our numbers there from a makeup of grad, undergrad, male, female, commuters versus students in residence halls. You can see our demographics across the world. You take a look here in the United States, where they come from. Again, 84 different nations represented. Top majors. In our statistics, 68 majors, 14 graduate, 2 doctoral programs. But what we knew we needed to do if we really want to fulfill our mission and build community, we needed to get rid of all the naming of technologies. Imagine being a freshman coming into our community and getting 10 different passwords, 10 different logins, 10 different acronyms for technology, Blackboard, D2L as Desire to Learn, the banner system, Chalk and Wire, the e-portfolio system. It's a maze for every freshman who comes onto campus. And so what we've decided to do is to say, hey, we know we need to go social, we know we need to engage people, but what's the software we can do that? But then how can we, pardon the language, white label it so that everybody can start believing that we have a vision to connect them into our community, and it's through GeoVision technologies, geo meaning earth, and then giving every student a vision of how they fit in to the life cycle. In essence, we're giving every student an imprint of who they are as a person. And so the key is developing the art and science of community, the art and science of technology, and then the art and science of great partnerships. And it's not easy. I can hire the greatest technologist in the world to come here and work at Oral Roberts University, but very few people understand the art of making technology work. And that's why we've made a conscious decision to go with Enterprise Hive, but we also made a conscious decision to hire our community. We have numerous work-study students, interns that are impacting us, and you'll hear from one of those shortly. So how would Oral Roberts University rank our community building or our success of building a community against the maturity model that Rachel shared? And again, without sounding like we've got it all together, we are trying to be real candid. I believe we, along with a lot of other universities, have a jump start on building community because it's very confined in a way. But the key is, what are the measurements that you're using? What are the metrics and measurements that you're using? Are we really talking to the community? Are we measuring the community? And so if you take a look at the footnotes at the bottom of this slide, the last one's important. It's critical to realign the language for appropriate metrics. What's the language you're going to use so that everyone in the community knows what you're talking about? And it's amazing to me how I can be in a meeting with students one day, faculty the next day, administrators the next day, and they all three have different views of the world, of the campus, of our community. In fact, the Chronicle of Higher Education did a wonderful article called The Elephant in the Room. Is that it's amazing which piece of the elephant that faculty see, the piece of the elephant that IT or technology sees, the piece of the elephant that students get to see, but the reality is there's still an elephant in the room, but nobody wants to look at the full elephant. And we believe that through the roadmap, this maturity model, along with the right software, the right integration, the right seamless integration, that we stand a great chance of building community and getting the elephants out of the room and getting great connection and great engagement moving forward. And so how did Oral Roberts University know community is engaging and working? What are the questions or metrics that we're asking? You can see them listed here, 6 of them. How does your community value, or what does your community value and believe? How does your community rank your strategy and tools? How does your community, or what does your community say about itself when they have a free voice? And that's key. Are you really giving your community a free voice, or are you doing some survey that's slanted towards an outcome? How do we know? I walk across the campus daily, and in front of other executives, I ask the students, how's the wireless working? And some days I don't want to hear the answer, but I still need to ask that because they need a free voice. They're paying the bills here. They're the ones who have the voice and are the ones who will be honest and most candid about how well our community is laid out and it's performing. And you can see the rest of the questions. I won't read those for you, but I want to jump to, if I could, sort of a summary. How can we substantiate the engagement community we're building? So, free voice. When you think about students, any day they can complain to me, they can complain to the president, to their parents. And so here at Oral Roberts University, we are privileged that at the beginning of my tenureship even, the students wrote a report. What is it they believe they want from technology? And just as importantly, what do they believe that the CIO advocates for technology? And so they've written that, and you can read the article on our website, oru.edu. 6 months later, what are the students saying? The students are still saying that IT is changing. We live in a community called a university that has to continually be changing, improving, and transitioning. But do we have a roadmap to make sure that we're doing it in the right fashion for the right reasons? And so another constituent within our community is higher education as a whole. As you can see from this slide, the White House Office of Science and Technology views Oral Roberts University as critical to helping change education through our research and through other things that we're doing here. So we hear from the students, we hear from education as a whole. What about our athletes? Putting wireless on the athletic bus so that they can actually connect back to the campus and be part of the community even though when they're traveling on a road trip. And so you can see no matter what angle I'm looking at, am I hearing from all the constituents of the community and finding out, is their belief system the same as my belief system? Are their values the same as mine or the IT teams, or I should say the administrative team? Here you can see the provost, Dr. Kathleen Reed-Martinez, working with one student on a pair of Google glasses. You know, does she have the same values as the students? And I'll tell you something phenomenal about our provost, is that she wanted me to put together a quotation for her, and she had sort of a mind of what she wanted to say, that technology in today's world is fluid and it should flow with students. So sort of crafted that for her, with her, and I gave it to her, and she said, you know, Mike, I like it, but I'd rather have you have students finish the quotation. And that was a powerful statement to say she gets the point that our community involves students and herself, and she's willing to partner at that level so that everyone feels a part. And I won't go into detail here, but the point is a scientist who was part of inventing, discovering the God particle, also known as the Higgs boson, here on campus, taking a look at who we are and what is it that we have to offer, meeting with our students. So again, our community expands around the globe, but how are we measuring it? Are we really reaching out to leaders? Are we game changers? Are we policy changers? But most importantly, do students feel engaged? And at that, I'm going to turn it over to our senior student, Alex Savalas, who actually, you can see him on this slide on the far left. He hosts a weekly show called Edufy, and he just, in fact, came out of a recording with our online dean and a few other people, a few other students, to find out what is online all about. And so at that, I'm going to have him talk a little bit about how does a student view community at a university campus.
Thank you, Mike. And for those listening, let me explain a little bit of the basis of Oral Roberts University. We have a principle: mind, body, spirit. The reason I mention that is because each floor, both male and female on campus, have a student leadership position. There are 3. The first one is the residential advisor. So the RA on the floor, the person who makes sure that the students are healthy and not doing anything damaging to themselves, they're going to class, following rules. Then you have your chaplain, the person who you can go to for prayer or some type of spiritual advice, which a lot of students on campus really utilize, us being a private Christian university. And then you have the academic peer advisor, the APA. Now this is a personal one to me because I'm actually the APA for my floor. So my position is to make sure that I gear students to finish their registration for next semester. My purpose is to help students decide if they're exploratory majors, what they want to major in, because they only have 3 or 2 years left. Typically freshmen and sophomore come to me with those issues. Those are the logistics for those leadership positions. Now, how does that deal with community? Well, here's how it does. The administration at ORU has a different type of philosophy than I've ever seen at previous institutions that I've visited and also attended. I'm a transfer student. The main factor is I've never been a part of a campus that was so student-run. At least close to 50% of how this school operates is through students. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we have a chapel service. Do you know the people who record it are all students? Yeah, only students record that. You go to different events on campus and students are hosting it. We have Order of the Golden Eagles, where we have 11 esteemed students who bring in visitors for the institution. They literally, the student will drive to the airport and pick them up. And that's the first person that person sees when they come into our country, is that student. What type of president puts that much trust into a student, an undergrad, doesn't even have a bachelor's degree? That's community that's unheard of in the academic arena. And I can go on and on and on, but the moral of the story here is that the community at ORU, it's like a bubble. Now that's an inside joke because ORU is considered a bubble because we have different principles we live by, and once you step off campus, it's a completely different world. But the world here is a community within the community, like Mike consistently hits on. And I couldn't say it any more clearly than the community at ORU is very liberating, and the students do get their voices heard. And Mike's right, students should get their voices heard because it's a teamwork. And I think as long as administration, faculty, and staff look at students as a peer and not a prodigy, you know, not just a mentor-prodigy relationship, but also as a peer, then I think we'll have success.
You know, thanks, Alex, so much. And for those of you who might be thinking, Alex just read from a script, he's that good of a speaker. In fact, Alex just returned from the state of Oklahoma intercollegiate legislation competition where he won the Senate debate. And so don't kid yourself. Alex will debate me every day about stuff he does not like about technology. He'll debate with anybody. And so what you just heard is candid information from one of our, what we believe, prize students who agrees with our philosophy of make no little plans here at Oral Roberts University. And again, I thank you so much, Rachel, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mike. And I was just struck by something Alex said, which, you know, is a marker of really good community culture, which is you may all know different things, you may have expertise in different areas, but you're all peers. And I think that's part of the ethos of community that a lot of organizations seem to have or struggle with some of the time if they're coming from a very kind of more controlled hierarchical culture.
Well, I want to thank, this is Lauren again from Enterprise Hive. I want to thank Mike and Rachel and Alex so much for providing us with such great knowledge, expertise, and information as we all think about building community, using online communities to build that community within a community. So I'd like to open up our webinar now for some questions and answers. And Mike, this first one is for you. What advice or best practices would you recommend to a higher ed institution looking to get started with community today?
You know, number one piece of advice is don't confuse students. You know, take a step back, put yourself in a student's or parent's shoes even, and find out where are the points of confusion where they can't become aligned, or you're putting stumbling blocks in the way because of the number of naming conventions in technology. And then, but tagged onto that, I would quickly, if I was a CIO at another university, find the quickest way to get something that looks close to Facebook, social media, and allows them to be engaged. I mean, we live in a day and age, there is no excuse left for chief information officers or administrative teams not to have something that engages students. And that's why Enterprise Hive was what we chose. It was simple, straightforward, and in fact, there's a cartoon that shows people looking around the corner in an IT shop around the corner to see if they're actually reading the materials or the literature sent out with the latest release of software. And when we put Enterprise Hive in, or I should call HiveSocial the actual product itself, that we never had to distribute information. They naturally used it. Students, professor assistants, professors, and they started communicating with each other. It was just natural for them to do it. That's why it's easy for me today to say there is no more excuses left why we're not engaged on every campus.
Great, thank you. Rachel, I have a question for you. What questions should a higher ed institution ask themselves to get started in an online community?
Well, so I go back to that shared value. I mean, I think Mike hit it on the head, which is first, you have to understand who you're working with. Like, you really have to understand the perspective of both your institutional stakeholders and your student population and the people who influence them, and in kind of college situations, that's often parents, but peers too, and really get to know them and figure out what that shared value is. What are you going to be working on together? And in higher ed, that should be relatively clear, meaning that mission to educate and develop well-rounded students is relatively universal. What that means to each institution is different. So aligning on those values that Mike talked about is also important. But figuring that out and how people want to work together, one of the things that I do think educational institutions could learn from how communities are being deployed in internal collaboration situations in the commercial side is people are starting to work out loud. And what that means is they're starting to encourage their participants, their community members, to share on a daily or a weekly basis what is going on in their world. And what that does is it basically creates a situation for serendipity to happen. The more you put what you care about out there, the more you connect with things you didn't know you didn't know. And in university environments, there's so much going on around the institution that no one person can keep a handle on all of those things. But the more you share online, the more other people will start connecting the dots for you. And that reduces duplication of effort. It allows for potential and collaborations that you didn't kind of see in your little corner of the universe. So some of that is really important to think about when you start. And again, being crystal clear what it is that you're trying to accomplish by having that online community is really helpful.
Thank you. And I think this next question kind of piggybacks on it, is really how do you measure which communities are best in class versus average? Are there certain benchmarks that should be used?
Yeah, so the way we did it, we were really looking at the community management process, not the outcomes, so keep that in mind. And we have, how we developed our research is with our members at the CR network, which is a practitioner network. We had a lot of our members work together with us to define what we think are objective markers of community management maturity. questions like, do you have a community playbook? That's a clear yes or no answer, but it's a marker of a more mature community management approach, meaning a one-place reference document that lays out everything anyone wants to know about community or community management. Do you have a fully resourced roadmap that's been approved? Like, that's a pretty easy question to answer. It's not necessarily easy to get to. So a lot of our questions were pretty clear questions like that people could answer pretty crisply. And from that, we combined all the questions around strategy into a score for strategy, an algorithm that defines a score for strategy. And we took the top 20% of performers to the overall maturity, and then we compared that segment's answers to everybody else's to just see, you know, our main question there was, does investment and in community management processes, does that matter? Does it have a performance difference? And what we found is it did have a significant difference on whether you could generate and measure value from your community or not. I don't know, was that clear enough?
I think so.
Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Now, you know, I noticed in the maturity model, you know, getting executive support for community initiatives is critical. But do you have any advice for getting that type of executive support for your community initiatives if your leadership team isn't as bought in as what we have, like with Mike at Oral Roberts? Rachel, I think that's a question for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons we have the community maturity model, and we also do a benchmarking service so that we can compare an institution's performance against our research. While the research is you can use it very tactically, I think the biggest benefit by far is as a communications tool. Mike alluded to this, which is you go to different constituent groups and they all think about their community differently. And what you really need to do is get everybody on the same page about how you're going to think about it and how you're going to measure that. It doesn't need to be the community maturity model. It can be your own model or your own framework. But framing the problem set and getting that kind of consistently socialized with everyone really allows you to have constructive conversations. We have a lot of members who, especially in the early days, before there was really a lot of research at all, they were going to their stakeholders and saying, I need a community manager. I need resources for this. And their stakeholders were saying, why? And they're like, I'm overwhelmed. There's more work than I can handle. That's not a powerful way to approach a stakeholder, because they need to see the specifics of where you're spending your time, why it matters, where the gaps are. And so a lot of the work that we've done is to add that specificity so that you can really have a constructive conversation with stakeholders and say, what do we all care about? What do we prioritize? What do we want at the end of the day? And okay, if that's what we want and this is how we're prioritizing it, okay, what are the resources we're going to have to invest in to get there?
Thank you. And then I have one final question, Mike, for you. What do you see next for community at ORU?
You know, it follows suit with what the Provost's dream is fluid technology. So you think of a day in the past 10 years ago where people would come and gather around technology in a classroom, in a lab. But the truth is, with wearable technology, mobile technology, we clearly can allow technology to travel with students. And if you call it mobile technology, call it what you want, but the key is, let's start being wise in understanding how students are using technology. So we see a day where we can reward students through Hive or HiveSocial, where we say, we know that on their wireless mobile phone, they're spending 3 hours a week studying for their classes. Let's reward them for that. Right now, people are too judgmental to say, hey, people are wasting too much time on social media and so forth, but let's reverse that. Let's understand how they're using it. Let's encourage them to use it, and let's let the technology flow with them.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And Mike, if I could just have you advance to the next slide. I want to thank all of you for spending time with us today with our webinar. Again, this was sponsored by Enterprise Hive. And I thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you,
you.
Mike, for having me.